So funny about this, Pierce, is that after all of this, once again, all of this, I'm an expert, you don't know this, I'm an expert, you haven't studied military 101, then after all of that, the substance of what we're left with is, right, okay, got it. After all of that, the substance that we're left with is Hamas started the war on October 7th. Yes, the most basic point that every pro-Israel person has made on this show forever. That's what you've got here. Okay.
I got a fact.
It's
now
not
you want
a
to debate
fact.
the facts
It's not
of
a
how
fact.
Israel
Israel's
could
been
achieve that goal.
By the way, you also don't even know what an appeal. It's not an appeal to emotion, by the way. That's not what it is. Although you do seem to be flirting with an appeal to authority. No, it's an appeal to morality. For me to describe the actual human impact of what this policy is resulting in is not an appeal to emotion. I mean, like, it's an appeal to morality, and it's an appeal to logic. An appeal to logic. Look, you can't answer me this very simple question, okay? Here's the very simple question. But let's just say, okay, the exact same action happened domestically. If someone were to do that, you would call it intentional murder, right? How does the concept of intentionality change because a politician uttered the word war, they declared it, and it's taking place in a foreign country? Without appealing to authority or appealing to law or appealing to what war normally is, can you as a human being explain to me how the concept of intentional changes magically because a politician uttered the phrase war?
The recent debate that set the internet on fire, Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. Murray tried to push a narrative, but when faced with Dave Smith's razor-sharp logic and undeniable truth, his arguments collapsed. On the Piers Morgan show, the battle reignited. Dave returned not to perform, not to posture, but to expose. John Spencer, echoing the same tired line, Hamas started it, and just like that, every bomb, every death, every child buried beneath rubble justified. But then Dave Smith walks into the fire with one question that cuts through the noise like a blade. If killing civilians is murder here, why isn't it murder over there? Because someone called it war? Because it's happening far away? Dave doesn't appeal to emotion. He appeals to something far more dangerous. Logic, morality, and the unbearable weight of truth. And in that moment, the mask of war slips. This isn't just a debate. This is a reckoning. And what comes next? Let's begin.
It works. And
So teach me. Stop telling me I don't know. Stop telling me I don't know and demonstrate it. Teach me
I didn't say you don't know. Your question, I'll teach you something. Your domestic law has a complete societal agreement on what those laws will be adjudicated and how they'll be determined.
No, it doesn't.
How a criminal deterrence, absolutely, American law.
Lots of people don't agree to the law.
If you kill somebody, then you'll be convicted of a crime based on a jury and a judge, all this. Then you want to apply that on war, but then disregard what the laws of war, the things that all nations have agreed to on. This is how we account for intentionality.
You can't do it without making an appeal to the law. You can't do it. You can't explain it to me logically.
But you're evaluating anybody who's below the 18 as a child. As in, you know that Hamas has basically charged. I joined the military at 17. Am I a child? And Hamas deploys. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16 and a half. We've seen them put weapons in hands of very young children. You have combatant and you have non-combatant. Is there any comparable status to the demographic of Gaza? No. Is there any comparison to where another country, Egypt, refuses to let even those that want out from the combat areas, and Israel, who took weeks to evacuate the civilians from the areas they're going into? So absolutely, there are so many here, but back to Dave's comment, which it stands on itself, explaining what he doesn't know about war or the laws of war, about them being codified and when they went into effect, or
hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of examples like this. But so there was a woman, a building collapsed. She says, as she's walking down the building, she can hear the little kids, not 16-year-old members of Hamas. You're talking 4- and 5-year-olds screaming for their mothers while they're buried underneath the rubble, screaming for help from their mommy. And you know what, Pierce? No help is coming because there's no bulldozers in Gaza. Nobody's coming to get those kids out. This is the reality of war. And this is what this is the main point that I was trying to make to Douglas Murray, which he kept running away from. If you're going to say that our goal here is to degrade Hamas, Murray conceded you probably can't eliminate eliminate them, but he feels like you can degrade them. If you're going to degrade Hamas, and the cost of it is those little children dying under rubble, screaming for their mother as their bones are crushed and no one's coming to help them, then fine. But at least say that you find that price acceptable. And then we could have a real conversation about why people are going to view you as a monster and why the other side will never stop fighting and will always be against you. If that was my kids, and I know, Piers, if those were your kids as well, you wouldn't want to hear anything about how, well, we've codified in international law that this is the norm of the way wars are allowed to be fought versus not allowed to be fought. I'm making a very human point that this is the reality of war. And you can say, under international humanitarian law, it's not considered intentional. We would consider this an intentional act in any other area. That's the point. It's a very basic human point. No, but I dropped a leaflet. No, I didn't really want to kill them. I just wanted to kill them. We'd go, I don't care. You blew up a building knowing there were kids in there. That's the essence of this whole thing. And there's no amount, there's no amount of expertise that can really get you away from this basic fundamental moral logic.
There's your moral argument right there, is that you do this to stop this. You take this number of lives to stop many more lives being killed. I mean, when you look at that, for example, what's your view of that moral debate?
Israel-Gaza, I think that entirely changes the scope of things because, look, as all of us know, right, Gaza was, before October 7th, the most surveilled area in the world. Israel is the fortress of the world. It was a monumental failure of both policy and security for October 7th to have happened in the first place. And it's just not the case that there's going to be October 7th after October 7th if Israel just stops now and leaves Gaza in the rubble mess that it is. And so that's exactly, like, I'm not I get your point, Piers, because you're almost going, wait, but if we follow this logic, then when could we ever fight a war? And essentially my point is that, yeah, the onus should be on anybody who wants to fight a war, ever. The onus should be on them to demonstrate that it is absolutely necessary and that there's nothing else we could do in this situation.
Two UFC fighters enter a ring and one punches the other in the nose, and Dave says, how dare he punches him in the nose in this fight? That's the analogy. He's not making an appeal to facts, how the law of war works, how war works, whether it's the theory underneath the war or the actual framework to understand it. He doesn't like theory like just war theory, things like that, but the framework that is there. Now, he just said that one side has to show that there's a military necessity, he doesn't know these words, but that's what he's talking about, to actually enter the war. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th.
I've never heard military necessity before. You blew my mind with your expertise.
Right, I know. It's like you need, I'll give you War 101 offline. That's fine. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th. Israel invoked Article 51, a self-defense war in accordance with the United Nations, again, more frameworks that people need to know, and said Hamas will be destroyed, removed from political power, and the hostages returned. Now, Dave has said that's not necessary, and that all Israel needs to do is put more men on the wall. That's what Dave said his solution, because he also doesn't study military theory on how do you win a war. He intermixes counterinsurgency theory with a war against removing a regime from power, defeating their military.
That's not what I was doing.
Factual. You said that was exact words on Lex Freeman. No. He's not making an appeal to facts. I'm debating. He's making an appeal to emotion and morals, not what the law.
Morals. I'm making an appeal to logic and morals.
Hamas started a war on October 7th. Hamas is going to lose a war.
John Daly said watching someone like Douglas Murray absolutely crucify Dave Smith is a real treat. And Con Tomlinson, Dave Smith is ignorant, Douglas Murray crushed him. And the only reason I read those three out is it shows me that on social media in particular, when these kind of events happen, and I call them events because everybody watches them, when they do happen, there's very little middle ground. There are very little people who pop up on social media and go, you know what, on the one hand, I thought Dave made some good points. On the other, Douglas made some good points, and I really enjoyed the experience, which is probably what Joe Rogan thought. But no, we're in a very tribal world where before you guys even sat down together with Joe Rogan, they'd already decided you were going to be disintegrated, dismantled, and crucified. And similarly, a lot of people who like you and don't like Douglas Murray felt exactly the same way about what was going to happen to him. Did Dave Smith and Douglas Murray debated who qualifies as an expert and who should be making declarative statements about certain wars? That question answers itself. And that's been construed, John, to mean that you believe that Dave Smith was not the expert in the room. Explain why you felt that Dave Smith lost this debate.
Sure. I wouldn't say it had anything to do with Douglas. I would have to say it was the statements that Dave Smith made during the podcast, which highlight, and I won't get into the credentialism as Dave's quoting four-star generals or who's an expert, who's not. I do research. I think Dave tells jokes for a living. I had problems with the statements he were made, and then how do you come to that conclusion, which really does get to the podcaster world versus other individuals on how did you come to that opinion or that declarative statement, like Israel's intentionally killing civilians? I mean, there's like 10 different ways you can do research. You can do comparative, case study. And I think this is what Douglas was saying. If you haven't been there, then how are you getting to your conclusion? You ethnographic, you can go there and do interviews in Gaza, like both Douglas and I have done with soldiers. What's going on? How are you doing it? You can do even historical archival data research. That's not what it appears that Dave does, and it seems to be more of a historical revisionism. Take a piece of data that you got and then tell a really convincing narrative on how you got to your conclusion in a statement like it's true. And I know Dave's anti-war, and that's great, but you can't be anti-factual. And Dave, without Douglas, just made a bunch of not true statement.
Me on Twitter the other day. I'm not saying that I'm not familiar, although I'm not claiming to have your level of expertise with international humanitarian law, or you can assert that war works a different way. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. What I'm saying is that Douglas is making the claim, and many others are, that Israel's killing of civilians is unintentional. And I'm talking about a very basic philosophical concept of morality, of intentionality, and that by what people mean when they say intentional, that if this was done domestically, we would consider it intentional. The point is that war, yes, look, there's been the Geneva Convention, there's international humanitarian law. It goes back to the mid-19th century, was codified into law after World War II. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a step in the right direction. But this is all a politician or a group of politicians declaring a word, and the fact that there are lines drawn on a map does not in any way magically transform morality or the basic philosophical concept of intent. And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken. And we've gotten all types of evidence about this. And there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro or macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally.
And you've just come back from Israel, Eric. I mean, where do you think we are with this war? And in terms of the moral debate that I had between Dave and John Spencer earlier about whether civilians are being deliberately targeted, what do you feel about that part of the debate about the war?
Tell you is the war is completely not portrayed accurately. And I just went back to a clip that I recorded with Konstantin Kisin on October 14th. So 7 days after and before Israel went into Gaza. And what I said was, this is Munchausen by proxy. Sinwar is the mother. He's desperately trying to get his women and children killed. This is not human shields, by the way. This is an innovation that I would call not human shields, but subterranean crosshair strategy, where you put your military tunnels underneath mosques, orphanages, schools, etc. Because the key in hybrid warfare is video. And video is much more powerful than the kinetic war. So Israel's winning the kinetic war, losing the hybrid war. Sinwar is still controlling it from his grave. And the only tell of this is that you still hold hostages in Gaza, Hamas does, and you're getting people to give a victory chant from the river to the sea, celebrating a genocide that has yet to happen. The whole purpose is to keep the world supplied with video, because none of us have the stomach, I can hear that Dave doesn't, I don't either, for watching war video. Because in part, Western Europe and North America has been at peace since 1945. We've lost the ability to watch war.
Eric, anyone who's watched the 45-minute film that Israel authorities produced of all the gruesome lowlights of what happened on October the 7th will feel the same sickening sense of utter revulsion that I felt when I watched it, as I have done to the scenes I've seen from Gaza. You know, it was utterly horrific what happened on that day. And so I completely understand why so many Israelis and Jewish people around the world have felt so utterly determined to get rid of Hamas at all costs. I totally get all this. But in relation to what Dave said at the end there, you know, just final word to you, where does that leave us, do you think?
I'm confused, because I watched these videos and I hate it. It scars my mind. I will never be the same person after watching. This hardens one's heart against whom? You know, my tweet that I keep reading from October 17th, before Israel went into North Gaza, IDF-assisted suicide, Zugzwang, Munchausen by proxy. I said, this is going to be horrific. Innocent life is going to be lost in Gaza. This is a plan. And every time I see that, and I see people holding hostages, I think, wow, how fascinating that the world can't put together the fact that Israel is in effect forced to move. And this was clear before Israel ever went into Gaza. Sinwar, one of the things I did when I was in Israel was to yell at the Israelis, saying, you had an evil genius who bested you. You pride yourself on your intellectual achievement. You lost. You're still talking about human shields. This guy's 2 moves, 3 moves ahead of you from the grave. And the fact is, I feel what Dave feels. I just feel it 100% towards Hamas. I don't understand. If people do not realize what war is, where it will be brought, whether it's Charlie Hebdo or the Bataclan or a parade in Nice, you are talking about a level of warfare that you cannot accept, because it is predicated on a strategy of women and children being the biggest munition in war. This is the great asset in hybrid war. And what we are seeing is an innovation that has to be stopped. Israel is so bad at this. It hasn't figured out. Imagine if they had the supposed imaging we have for under the pyramids to map the tunnels of Gaza. Imagine that they developed ingenious ways of getting down there to spare more life. This is a call for Israel not to lose its soul. But the fact is that it's being outplayed by a dead master strategist. And, you know, my feeling is that when Israel speaks and tries to justify itself, it tends to lose me. The way that I really shifted my sympathies in this whole thing was by listening to the Arabs and listening to Hamas. And when they justify this, I just think, my God, as bad as I think Netanyahu has been in handling all of this, the absolute genius and complete evil of the Arab position here is something that has to be contested, and Israel does not appear to have better means to do it.
And Eric, what did you make of the debate with Dave and Douglas?
Is that he called in Dave because Dave, whether he's an expert or not, I will say he has a tremendous number of facts that go against the Israeli narrative, and that whether or not he's considered to be, a self-credentialed scholar, I haven't really looked at Dave's work enough to know. I would say that what Joe was doing was to say, I want to make sure that Douglas is balanced because I, Joe, believe that barbarism is being defended, and I'm not comfortable with that. But because we don't have the backstory to it, we don't really realize what happened in the first opening moments of the exchange, which was very, very strange.